Hey pals, I'm here today to talk about the books I read in the month of March. So I read 9 books in March, which is a bit less than the previous months because in January and February I read 13 books each month. However, I did DNF 6 books in March, and when I had a little look, I read some of them, I read quite far in. So in total I read 700 pages of pages that I then gave up on, so I'm not going to talk about those books here. So yeah, it's a shame because I could have fit in like a couple more books that I read and really enjoyed, but I didn't. But I do talk about all of my DNFs over on my Patreon. It's for my tier 2 patrons. If you're tier 1 or tier 2, you get to hear me talk about my DNFs every month, and I've really been enjoying doing that. I've only been doing it for 3 or 4 months, and before that I just sort of every now and again I mention DNFs on here, and then most of them I just forget. And it's been really good because it's been a way for me to track my DNFs, and also tracking them has made me be more thoughtful about what leads me to DNFing a book, and hopefully will mean that I don't have months in the future where I DNF 6. I will briefly mention here, I'm not going to talk about it in any detail because I've got 9 other books to talk about, that I did DNF The Great Circle about halfway through. So if you want to hear more about that, then my Patreon is always linked down below. So, what 9 books did I actually read? I think I'm just going to talk about these in order of in order of when I read them, but I'm going to talk about the fiction first and then the non-fiction at the end, just because that's what I feel like today. So the first book is The Bone Ships by R.J. Barker. Borrowed this one from the library. I've already spoken about this in a sort of fantasy recent reads wrap up, which I'll link up above. What I'll briefly say is this is a fairly complicated high fantasy book that is set at sea on these bone ships, and I admired the world building, and like I said, it was all quite complex and I found that all quite intriguing. I also think the writing style I enjoy, closer to Rob and Hob, and then it feels quite sort of oldie worldy, I guess quite formal, which I enjoy in fantasy. However, what I think this really lacked for me was character development. The book just spent a lot of time getting from A to B, so it wasn't necessarily fast paced, but a lot of the dialogue, a lot of the interactions were focused on like how to move the ship and what decisions to make. There wasn't many conversations that allowed the characters to, like, I don't know, for me to care more about them. So it's the first book in a trilogy. I gave it 3 stars. I think I will carry on, but I do hope that in the next book I start to care more about the characters, and if not, I probably won't finish the trilogy. The next book is one I also borrowed from the library, although I did decide a couple of pages in to listen to this on audio and read along, which I would 100% recommend if you were planning to pick this book up. Like, the audio was a brilliant way to go. So the premise of this book is that it's set on a very small isolated island off the coast of Ireland, and there's like less than 50 people left living on this island, and they are a community that continue to speak Irish rather than English. And we are sort of introduced to these people by way of an English artist who is going to stay on the island. He is paying them bed and board to look after him, under the premise that he's going to go there and sort of revitalise his career by painting the landscape and the nature. And when he gets there, they're very clear with him, they don't want him to paint them, they don't want to become sort of objects that are put on the walls of an English gallery, they only want him to paint the sort of natural landscape. And he's like, yeah, that's fine. You're told this in the blurb. Another gentleman sort of joins the fray, and he is a Frenchman who's been coming to the island for the last 4 years and studying them speaking Irish, and he's trying to study how a language is lost. So he's looking at how through the generations, each subsequent generation that lives on this island, of which there's like 4 within one family, how each of them slowly starts to speak more and more English in general conversation. And there is a conflict between these 2 men because the Frenchman feels that this Englishman coming to the island is entirely disrupting his studies, and also is encouraging these Irish speakers to speak English in order to be welcoming to this Englishman. So the book is really strongly talking about colonisation, these men being from 2 countries that colonised lots of other countries and did lots of awful things, and this sort of battle of wills, with the knowledge that at the time this book is set during the Troubles, and that's something that's sort of mentioned throughout the book, that the English are doing awful things in Ireland, and this man's also coming to this island and sort of diminishing their language. And so there's lots of really interesting discussions about that, which I very much enjoyed. Neither of these men are likeable. All the people on the island are. There is a young boy who lives on the island, who's sort of about 16, 17 years old, and he gets really friendly with the painter and starts to do his own work, and there's a real push and pull there between who owns art and what is like theft of a concept. So there's just lots of interesting discussions about what a colonising country are willing to take, and it is performed in all its minutiae by these French and English men on this small island. It's beautifully written, very descriptive of the landscape and the food and things like that, but it's quite different. And the reason I thought this might be a favourite book of the year is because it really stands out in its storytelling. If you were to look at this book in print form, there are no quotation marks, and the book goes from third to first person within the same sentence. And so at points you'll be reading, like having what the painter's doing described to you, and then he can be talking out loud and it will shift into like what he's saying in his head, or vice versa. You might be reading something as him thinking it, and then one of the other people on the island says to him, "Oh, why do you always talk out loud?" And you wouldn't have known that if he hadn't have said that, because there are no speech marks. So the book is filled with these sort of monologues that are part actual talking and part thoughts, which I think was performed really well on audio, and I think maybe I would have struggled with that a bit more had it been, if I'd just been reading it. I think maybe this book for me, like the wrap-up of it wasn't as strong as the sum of its parts, but I'd still definitely recommend it, and it felt quite unusual. And like I said, it does comment on the Troubles, so interspersed with the main body of the story on this island, you get real historical events that happened of people who were killed during the Troubles on both sides. And as you get further and further into the narrative, as things are becoming more and more violent, these start to become more common and more gruesome, and they start to affect the people on the island, and it becomes part of their dialogue. So yeah, I thought this was a really good read, a really unique one, and I definitely recommend it. Then I'm going to talk about a couple of newly released historical fiction novels that I was a bit disappointed in. I borrowed both of these from the library, and they're both books that in hindsight I sort of wish I had DNF'd, because they're going to be pretty forgettable. But the reading mood I was in at the time of picking them up was like, I just felt like reading something that was easy and I could maybe read in like 2 sittings, and both of these books certainly gave me that, but they just were sort of overall disappointing. The first one I did enjoy a bit more, and that's The Leviathan by Rosie Andrews. So both of these books are set in Norfolk. I'm pretty sure The Leviathan is as well, I think that's why I picked it up. And I live in Norfolk, if you didn't already know, and so I'm always interested to see books set here, particularly historically, because it's interesting to see what these places were like hundreds of years ago. The premise of The Leviathan is that a young man is coming back home from the English Civil War, and he receives a letter from his younger sister, who's about 16, saying, "We've got this new housemaid, and I think she's bringing some sort of dark presence to the house and having an effect on our father, and there's like hints of witchcraft." When he arrives home, his father is very ill, all of their sheep are just like dead on the fields, and the young housemaid has already been taken to jail and accused of witchcraft, and the witchfinder general is being sent to interview the family. So we sort of follow from this point, as the brother doesn't really believe that anyone is doing anything witchy. He's questioning his belief in anything outside of our realm, so he's not sure whether God exists, but he certainly doesn't think witchcraft exists, and he doesn't want these things to be coming from his family. He doesn't want accusations of witchcraft to be perpetrated by his sister, because he knows how quickly that can be turned and like she could then be accused. So I thought that was quite an interesting commentary. I think it's unusual in these historical fiction novels to get particularly a male character saying that they think all of this stuff is like rubbish. And this is certainly quite beautifully written, quite descriptive, it feels quite gothic, but as you can tell from the title, there is more to this story than just witchcraft, and the second half of the novel, without any spoilers, becomes much more than that, much weirder than that, and in large part a discussion about religion, and like the brother has to make a really big decision. So I thought that the first half of this book for me was stronger, the second half just wasn't as interested in it, and I felt a bit like meh about it. One thing I really enjoyed about this novel is there is a scene when he comes to Norwich to like interview somebody, and at the time Norwich was the second biggest city outside of London, which is insane. Like Norwich is a really small city now. We have like a couple of 100,000 people live here, which is absolutely nothing compared to some larger cities. So just really interesting to see Norwich as this like hub of activity, and the location that he describes was where we used to live in the city centre, and he was calling like the city centre like Norwich over the water, which is a phrase that's completely not in use anymore. If you haven't visited Norwich, there is a river that runs around the city centre, and so you have to cross bridges to get to the actual city centre, which is something like I don't think about at all now as somebody who lives in Norwich. But back then would have been a much bigger deal, because the money to pay for those bridges would have been a big thing at the time. So yeah, that was interesting. This was like a 2.5, maybe a 3-star read for me. I think if you're really into sort of gothic historical fiction, you might enjoy it more than me, but yeah. The next one is The Marsh House by Zoe Somerville. This is a dual timeline narrative. It opens in December 1962. We're following this young mother who is fleeing to a house on the North Norfolk coast that she has been sort of given some information about. So she decides to flee there with her young daughter because she's found out her husband is having an affair. And when she gets to the house, she's been told her mother recently died, and on her mother's deathbed she says, there's something your father and I never told you, and it's somehow linked to this house, which is why she's gone there. But when she gets there, she finds a box in the attic that contains these old diaries. And this is very reminiscent of I Captured the Castle by Dodie Smith, which is actually set in Suffolk, which is a county that borders Norfolk. And they're very similar, like landscape-wise, if you go to either of them. So in I Captured the Castle, it opens with Cassandra. It's got a famous opening line where she says, "I write this to you sitting in the kitchen sink," something like that. And she writes in 3 notebooks, and she tells you when each notebook changes. And a big part of that story is that she is from a less well-off family who are living in this sort of decrepit castle, and a wealthy family move into the local hall, and these two families start to know one another, and it changes the direction her life goes. Now, I Captured the Castle is a very sweet novel. It was written for like teenagers of that era, before YA was a thing. The Marsh House is like a dark version of that, basically, because the exact same thing happens. So I think it's 100% inspired by I Captured the Castle. She has these 3 notebooks, but in the opening page of the notebook she tells you she's writing it from prison, and she then goes back to tell you about her life growing up and how this wealthy family moved into the local hall, and how she became involved with them, and they were very heavily involved in the fascist party. So there's sort of discussion about that, which I always find quite interesting. But what I found with this is, like, in both narratives, it's pretty clear to me as a reader how these people are going to be linked, and also what the woman is in prison for. Like, from the absolute start, it's like you can figure it out. It's not difficult. And the writing in and of itself and the characters in and of themselves are not enough to allow for just a really basic storyline. And so what you have is a dual timeline narrative that's been done to death with nothing particularly new or special about it, which feels really cruel. Like, the writing isn't bad by any mean, but like, yeah, none of it feels particularly new or exciting. So like, for me, this is a 2-star read. Like I said, there's nothing bad about the writing, it's just a really forgettable book for me. So there's that one. And then we have Everyone Is Still Alive by Cathy Rentzenbrink. And I think this is quite funny because I did a library book haul recently, which I'll link up here. And I mentioned that The Great Circle by Magee and Everyone is Still Alive by Cathy Rentzenbrink were both due at the library on the same day, and I was like, oh, please help me with which books I should read. And loads of people responded and said, you have to read The Great Circle before it's due back, it's absolutely brilliant. And quite a few people responded and said, don't bother with Everyone is Still Alive, it's an okay book, but it's pretty forgettable. I wouldn't waste your time on it. And I was like, okay, so I started on The Great Circle, and as I said, I DNF'd it halfway through. And I just really felt like reading Everyone is Still Alive, and I kept thinking, oh, everyone said not to bother, but I'm just gonna try a couple of chapters. I really enjoyed it. I read this in 2 sittings. It is a pretty like run-of-the-mill story that for me, there was a lot that just worked and sort of elevated it for me as a reader. Now this is a book that I completely get that a lot of people would just think this is an entirely mediocre read, but there are certain things as a reader I really enjoy, and this sort of has those things. So this is set in the present day. We are following from the perspective of a sort of working mother and wife. So she is the sort of breadwinner of the family, and her mother has recently passed away, and they have moved into her mother's house on this road called Magnolia Drive in London. And her husband is a published author, and he's been struggling to write his next novel, and he decides to base his upcoming novel on the very sort of middle class gossipy people of this street. And so he's doing the school runs with their little boy, and he gets involved with all these women and all their gossip. And the book is really a commentary on the idea of that sort of middle class suburbia. So they've come from an area in London that they much preferred, which had much more sort of culture and diversity, and they feel now that they're living in this place that's quite sort of boring and lacklustre. So there's lots of commentary on that. Also broadly, this is a commentary on family roles, and this is something I find really interesting when we talk about gender roles, particularly when children and young children are involved. And a lot of the discussion in this novel is that their gender roles are flipped, in that the dad is a stay-at-home dad. Yes, he's writing a novel, but a lot of his time is spent taking his son to school and play dates and things like that. And a lot of the mother's time is spent working way more than full-time at this really high-stress job. But yeah, she still does most of the cooking and cleaning and the organising. So that's a really interesting discussion throughout the novel. And there's also a concern throughout the novel that she thinks like her husband might be getting a bit too close to all these women. So it's just a really interesting family story. You're told in the blurb, there is an event that happens that sort of shakes the foundation of this street. And there is, and I wasn't expecting it to be what it was. I think it was well done. And yeah, so I think some people might just think this novel is a bit cliche. I don't want to spoil anything about the ending, but I can see how some people might think, oh, you know, and I do think the final chapter was perhaps a little bit unnecessary, like everything was wrapped up quite neatly. But I think what this was an interesting commentary. All these couples are, I think, married with children, and you sort of get commentary on 4 couples, and they're all managing their marriage and their children very differently. And it's an interesting discussion about what people want from a marriage, and sort of shared parenting, and how your like dreams and expectations aren't always met, and how you can either sort of settle or ask for more. And yeah, I just found this a really sort of cosy, easy, also quite funny. I've realised that something I really enjoy is sort of humour about young children. Like when young children say things that are like really callous or heartless and they just don't realise it is. I find all that really funny. But even though I'm not a mother, I find all that sort of thing fascinating. So yeah, for a lot of people, this will probably be a bit like, meh, whatever. But for me, I found it quite funny. I found it really readable and just cosy, and I'll definitely read whatever fiction she brings out in the future. And then the last novel is one I listened to on audio. This wasn't very long on audio at all, I think about 6 hours. And that is Brown Girls by Daphne, Palasi and Andreades. So I borrowed this from the library, and then I read the first couple of pages and I was like, do you know what? I bet this is brilliant on audio, and I'm so glad I went down the audio route with this, so I'd highly recommend it if you can find the audiobook. I listened to it on Scribd. This is just brilliant. So this is how do I put this? This is a contemporary novel which is told from the plural, and I originally thought that this was going to be about 5 girls in particular, and they grow up in the dregs of Queens, New York, and you're introduced to them when they're sort of young girls, maybe around, you're not told an age, but it feels like they're probably around 8, and they're all friends, and you're told about when they go out and play out together and like what they get up to. And the book, like I said, it's told in the plural, and like I said, I thought it was going to be about 5 girls specifically. It isn't. It's always told in the plural, but you're given so many different names, and I think the whole point in this book is that it's supposed to be commenting on the lives of brown girls who live in areas like Queens, New York, and the lives they have to lead and the choices they can and can't make. And so this book goes from that point of them being young girls all the way up until the point of like their death, without any specifics about just the inevitability that like everyone's going to die. So it goes through all the life stages you could possibly have, and at each point it comments on the different choices each of these women make, and perhaps the ways in which any choice will be judged. And also at all points there's a commentary on what difference their race makes to those decisions. So for example, one that I found really a memorable discussion was one about what type of careers they had and where they decided to live. So for the ones of them who decided to move out of Queens and perhaps work like as lawyers and earn a lot of money and were like the only person of colour who were working for the law firm, they've decided that life, and so in a way they feel like they've like beat the system and that's what they wanted for themselves and for their friends. But in another way there's this shame attached to that, because when they go back to Queens and see their friends, they feel like they're saying, this wasn't good enough for me, I've won, I've got all this, I'm all that. And then the women who have stayed in Queens also have this shame at the fact that they're in the same place they were when they were children, the place they always promised to get out of, but they feel like they haven't betrayed their community by leaving, and they feel like the women who've left can no longer comment on Queens because, well, you're not here anymore, like you're not part of it. And there's also like each chapter looks at a different thing, like whether they date white boys or boys of the same race as them, whether they go and travel back to the countries their parents came from or they came from, and how they feel when they're there, if they're treated differently. And this book is very lyrical and it's very listy, okay? So like, because you're hearing about all of these different women and you're given all of these different names, every time there's this life thing, you're given like almost a list of all the different choices that are made. So if you don't like books that are written in that sort of like lyrical listy way, this won't be for you. I do think that sort of thing comes across better on audio than it will in the physical form. So for me, this was a really strong read, and it also felt quite unique. I was thinking about both this and The Colony, both of them felt quite different in form to books I've read before. I think the thing that stopped, because I thought I could absolutely love this, and the thing that stopped me from absolutely loving it is I am definitely a character-based reader, and this isn't really that, because you get so many different names, and it does feel like this is like commenting on like brown girls as a group, rather than saying like, this is the individual who made this choice, this is the person who did this, and following them throughout their whole life. You don't feel at the end there's one person who you do for a certain reason, and you know that if you've read it, but everyone else you don't think, oh well, I remember that Shania decided to do this job and she did visit her parents' country and she did marry this person and she did do that. Like, their names are sort of switched at every point, so you couldn't follow one individual all the way through. And because I'm a character-focused reader, I just didn't have as much connection to characters as I like, but I'd still really recommend this one. Okay, then we have 3 non-fiction books, and I'm going to talk about these both in the order that I read them and in my order of enjoyment. So this one I enjoyed the least, I have 2 stars, and that is Red River Girl, The Life and Death of Tina Fontaine by Joanna Jolly. I listened to this one on audio, so let me briefly explain what this is about first. So in 2014, Tina Fontaine, she's a 15-year-old girl, and her body was found in the Winnipeg River. She was a young native girl who had travelled to Winnipeg to spend some time with her mother, She wasn't previously raised by her mother because her mother was an addict, but she decided to travel there, and she'd sort of gone missing, and her foster parents had been reporting her missing repeatedly, and hadn't been able to find her, and then basically her body was found. And it was a massive news story, quite uniquely so, in that Canada, but that area of Canada in particular, is known for a disgustingly high rate of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, to the point where some of them barely ever hit the papers, and plenty of them are never resolved, they're never investigated, a suspect is never found, the women and girls are never found. And so it's quite unique in that Tina Fontaine was such a big story. And there's a couple of reasons for this. She was 15 and she was a very pretty girl, so obviously the papers are going to absolutely love that. But also it happened at a time when the public were becoming more aware of the fact that there were all these missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and they were asking the government to do more about it. And so it was almost like this one case was upheld as a case they had to solve to like prove a point. So Joanna Jolly was a Indian British journalist who had previously worked in Asia, and she had moved to work for, I think still working for the BBC but in Canada, and she heard this story and decided to investigate. So I think what you need to know going into this is that previously the author had no real knowledge of the Canadian justice system or of this social issue in particular. So this book is very like entry level in that regard. And I don't usually read true crime because I find that most true crime is morbidly curious, gruesome, and is there for entertainment. And I don't think what we should be getting from true crime is entertainment. I think what we should be getting is education, and we should be informed of the ways in which our society is failing. And I don't think that is really what most of true crime is aiming for, but I thought this one might be, so I decided to give it a go. So, sentence by sentence level, this is like, you can tell this is written by like a journalist, and that it's not particularly like beautiful, it's like giving you the information you need to know. It's easy to follow on audio. And to begin with, I was thinking, you know, this is pretty good. She introduces Tina Fontaine and her life and the people around her, and she gives you a real idea of who she was. This book is pretty graphic. I don't know if it really needed to be. So what I mean is, and without going into details, you are told about the autopsy report in graphic detail, and yeah, I just don't really know if that's necessary. I don't know like who it really helped. It didn't really give a ton of information about like finding who did it for us as the readers, so I don't think that was necessary. But what really bothered me about this book in the end, and what resulted in me giving it 2 stars, is that the second half becomes much more focused on one suspect they have in particular. And actually, you finish the book and feel like Tina Fontaine's been entirely lost, and it's become what I don't want true crime to be, which is instead this big discussion and like character analysis of the person who may or may not have done it. And I just don't think that's the whole point in Tina Fontaine's story being so big was because it was representative of a massive issue in Canadian culture, and just focusing on this one individual who may have done it isn't really addressing that. So that was an issue for me. And also another issue I had was that there's a really big focus on the lead police detective in this case, to the point where I felt a little bit like he was being hero worshipped. And I think at the core, the reason there is such a big problem, one of the reasons why there is such a big problem with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is the complete racism is entrenched in the justice system, down to the level of police officers on the street in Canada. And there are points when there is a point where 2 police officers pull a car over. Tina Fontaine is in the car with a man who's clearly much older than her and probably soliciting her illegally for sex. she's listed on the missing persons database. They ask her name, she gives her real name, and they don't notice that she's listed as missing, and they let her go away, and 2 days later, like, she's dead, you know? So that, and that's something she mentions, and she's like, oh, it's an issue, but then we don't dwell on it. And I think what this book should have been dwelling on was why these things happen. In this book, you find out about so many other young girls and Indigenous people who are on the streets, who are really struggling, who clearly need so much support. That's what this book should have been interrogating. Like, what we need to do, not to just be like, here's this hero cop, and didn't he try his best, and like, here's everything he did to try and solve this one case. Like, instead, let's talk about what leads to these things happening, what we could have done before to stop it happening, and what we can change to stop more of these things happening again. So in the end, I just found this book entirely frustrating, and I wouldn't recommend it. Run over. Then I read 2 essay collections. These are the only 2 books I read off my TBR, which is obviously very bad. The first one is Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine and the Foundations of a Movement by Andreades. This is quite a short book, it's about 150 pages. As you can see, I tabbed a lot. This is a collection of interviews and speeches mainly. And one thing I had heard about this book, which I agree about, is that it's quite repetitive, because this sort of follows maybe 6 years in Angela White Davis' sort of history. And so a lot of the speeches, by the time you get to the end of this, you do feel like you've heard it. However, I think that individually, all of these speeches are excellent. I really love what she has to say and how she says it. And I also think that I didn't really mind reading things that felt like a repeat, because I felt like it like embedded it in my mind, and like repetition made me remember it more, which I quite enjoyed. So I definitely recommend this, and I think the audio is really good to listen along to. And I particularly enjoyed the interviews, because I think her and the interviewer are both sort of activists and academics, and they really sort of challenge one another, and those discussions went further than the speeches did. So yeah, definitely recommend that one. And that made me want to read essay collections like more regularly. So the essay collection I decided to pick up next was White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Portrays Women of Colour by Ruby Hamad. I'm really scared to do this review because an ice cream van's just pulled up outside my house. I mean, it's really cold today. And it keeps turning on the little jingle. It's making me very angry. So if they keep being like odd cuts and then I look really annoyed afterwards, that's why. I absolutely love this. I gave it 5 stars. And it's the sort of book I find really difficult to talk about, and like how to convince you to pick it up, because this type of non-fiction book, the only way in which I can like convince you to read it, I sometimes feel, is just by like repeating everything I was told in the book and being like, and then I learned this, and like this is really fascinating and this was really insightful. I mean, obviously, like, you might as well just read it then. I obviously loved it. I tabbed nearly every page, which is like a bit pointless, but still did it. The premise of this is that Ruby Hamad she wrote an article, so she's an Australian journalist, and she wrote an article, I think maybe for like, I can't remember, a famous newspaper, about the fact that white women cry a lot in the workplace when a woman of colour accuses them of racism, and how that tends to result in the woman of colour being penalised and the white woman being like, you know, patted on the back basically. And that had such a massive response, Ruby decided to write a whole book about that topic. And the book is split into 2 chunks, the first of which is the setup, and that explains how we got to this point, like historically, how we got to this viewpoint that we, like, in the deep recesses of our mind, our biases tell us that white women are victims. When we think of a victim, what we picture is a white woman, unless we're picturing children, and then like maybe not. And how we got there. And so what she does is, and what I like, my number 1 point about this book that I really admired and don't think is something that often happens, is that the author is really careful to try and talk about every region of the world. So a lot of the times these sort of things are really US focused, or they're really focused on the country from which the author's from, and she really doesn't do that. She obviously talks about people in all different regions, And so what she does is, like for example, a title of one of the chapters is Lewd Jezebels, Exotic Orientals, Princess Pocahontas, How Colonialism Rigged the Game Against Women of Colour. And she talks about all these different regions, and what she does is she talks about how each of these parts of the world were colonised by white people, and what racial stereotypes started to be perpetuated about the women of colour who were there already. And the consensus that she comes to is that when we entered these countries, usually by force, there was this system at play in which we were always quite a Christian society, a lot of these countries that invaded. And so our Christian morals said that our women have to be like fully covered, and if they're walked anywhere they need to have a man chaperoning them, and we need to really protect them. They're like this perfect version of victimhood basically. But that by doing that, the men who basically think they're owed everything because they've just invaded this country and they think they're like fucking brilliant, still have these urges to basically sexually assault women. And so what they did is they put these horrible racial stereotypes on the women of colour that were there, that sort of in their mind allowed them to perpetuate these crimes against those women because they're not the same as our women. And so all of these racial stereotypes were enforced in order to allow white men, in their minds, allow them to just do whatever they wanted to these women. And in every part of the world, in every type of colonialism, she talks about what those stereotypes were and she breaks them down. And then she goes on to talk about how they're perpetuated now, and then the second half of the book is talking about the results of that, and she sort of breaks down each chapter, focuses on a different topic. So that's one thing that I really admired, that she talks about every part of the world. Another thing I really admired about this book is that it clearly reads like a collection of essays that were written to be together. Sometimes you pick up a collection of essays and you can tell some of them were written to be published in like a magazine or in a journal or something, and they've sort of been pulled together. And what happens when you read a book like that is every now and again they'll repeat the same anecdote but not acknowledge that they're repeating it. And you can just tell, it takes you out of the book, you're like, oh, these weren't written to go together. Because this was written to go together, not only do the essays not repeat themselves, but what the author's able to do is to say, so you know that thing we discussed in chapter 2, that woman we discussed there, or that historical case we discussed there, like this is like the present day repercussions of that, and let's talk about that now in this context. And so the book continues to like remind you of what you've already learned, and give you more information about it, which is something I really admired. I mean, this book will make you livid. It is horrendous, like the things you're told are absolutely horrendous, and it's awful that in basically every region the colonisers found an excuse and a different reason to treat these women so awfully. And in doing that, in treating the women of colour who were there so awfully, it lifted white women up to this sort of untouchable victimhood. And her discussion at the end of the book, in the sort of final essays, is about the fact that white women have to be willing to not say what we want from feminism is to be on the same level as white men, which is what is the ice cream van. Okay, I'm going to try and carry on. It just doesn't feel like the right book for an ice cream van jingle to be going on in the background of. So, what we've historically been asking for is to be on the same level as white men, and what we should instead be saying is the level at which they're at is horrific. The things they perpetuate because of white patriarchy is awful, and none of us want to be on that level. Instead, we should talk about all women and discuss the fact that we don't want to continue to move towards white patriarchy because historically it hasn't worked, and instead we want to do something different. And she articulates that a million times better than I ever could, and I could sit here for hours and read all these things out to you, but it feels sort of pointless because like there's so many, and like how can I choose? One thing I will say, which I found really shocking, is that the only countries to have entirely escaped some form of European control are Japan, Korea, Thailand and Liberia. How vile is that? 4 countries out of all the countries in the world have not had some type of control by Europe. Absolutely abhorrent. So that was like one of the things I read that was just like awful. So yeah, absolutely loved it. I think more people should read it. And I do really think, like, if you think, oh, this sounds a bit like too much, I think it is pretty readable. It's obviously more in depth than a lot of the more entry-level feminist texts out there are, because it's talking about a specific thing. But I think in talking about that specific thing, she really gives you enough information for it not to be overwhelming or confusing. So I found it really readable, and I think like everybody should pick it up. So there we go. And those 2 non-fiction books really made me just want to read way more non-fiction throughout the rest of the year. So that is my intention. So we shall see how April goes. Okay, that took me way longer than I thought, so thanks for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!